It was late afternoon when Julia stepped into the grand hall of the Royal Academy of Arts. Golden lights reflected off the polished marble floor, and the tall mirrored walls made every detail gleam as if the place itself were alive. To anyone from the outside, this looked like a temple of dreams, a sanctuary where only the children of the elite could showcase their talents. But for Julia, it was just another reminder that she didn't belong in this world. At 13 years old, Julia carried a body that didn't match the rigid standards of the Academy's girls. She had a few extra pounds, wore plain clothes, and her skin carried the warm brown tone she inherited from her mother. Rosa, her mother, was the one responsible for cleaning the academy. While the daughters of businessmen, judges, and doctors rehearsed their routines, Rosa was on her knees scrubbing the floor with soap and water, her hands cracked from years of work. Julia usually sat in the corner, quiet, clutching an old notebook where she scribbled dance steps and notes. She loved to observe, to study every move with her eyes, as if each ballerina's turn was a secret lesson just for her. But for the other girls, Julia was nothing more than the maid's daughter, invisible, until they decided to make her the center of their cruel amusement. That day, the hall echoed with muffled giggles. Clara, the group's leader, 14 years old, blonde, blue-eyed, and always surrounded by her loyal followers, leaned in to whisper something. The girls around her laughed, their eyes darting toward Julia. Clara didn't need to say much. Her gestures alone dictated the game. Invent new ways to remind Julia she didn't belong. "Hey, Julia," Clara called out, her tone sweet, almost too sweet to hide the malice beneath. The girls laughed louder, forming a half circle around her. Julia's face flushed, her heart racing. She tried to bury her eyes in her notebook, as if ignoring them could make her disappear. But it was too late. They had chosen her as today's target. "Come on, don't be shy," another one teased, her voice dripping with mockery. "We'll even give you a chance to shine. Isn't this the stage you're always staring at?" Across the hall, Rosa froze for a moment. She clenched the damp rag in her hand, breathing deeply before forcing herself to continue cleaning. She had lived through this kind of cruelty before. But inside, a storm brewed, an anger she had carried for years, now burning for her daughter. Julia, meanwhile, stood frozen in her chair. All eyes were locked on her, waiting for the show, expecting her to stumble, to fail, to shrink into the shadows where they thought she belonged. What they didn't know, what they could never imagine, was that Julia wasn't just the cleaning lady's daughter. Deep inside her, she carried something that none of them had ever seen before. Clara's smirk widened as Julia kept her eyes on the floor, hoping the moment would pass. But silence was not an option. The laughter grew sharper, like knives carving into her pride. "Come on, Julia," Clara pushed, stepping closer, her expensive ballet shoes clicking against the floor. "You sit here every day, watching us like some kind of little spy. Let's see what you've actually learned." The circle tightened. Phones began to appear, glowing screens raised like weapons, ready to record every second of Julia's embarrassment. The plan was simple. She would try, fail, and become the Academy's favorite joke for weeks. "You can't just sit here pretending you belong," another one added, crossing her arms. "If you want to stay in this room, prove it." Julia's throat tightened. She could feel her pulse in her ears, feel her face burning. Every fiber of her wanted to run, to hide in the cleaning closet where no one would see her. But she sat still, gripping her notebook so hard the pages crumpled. Across the room, Rosa's hands moved faster with the rag, her knuckles white. She didn't lift her head, but her mother's intuition told her exactly what was happening. She had heard that cruel tone before, when she was a little girl herself, mocked for being poor, for being brown, for daring to dream of a stage she was never allowed to step on. Clara raised her voice, as if she were a master of ceremonies. "All right, girls, let's make it interesting." She snapped her fingers dramatically, and the others giggled. Julia will try a routine. If she can't keep up, she'll never sit here again. She'll stay outside where she belongs." Gasps and laughter rippled through the group. Even the younger ones, nervous at first, joined in the chorus of mockery. "Yeah," Sophia added, her phone camera already pointed at Julia. "And if she refuses, we'll all know she's nothing but a wannabe, just a maid's daughter pretending to be one of us." The words cut deeper than Julia expected. Her mother had told her many times not to let cruelty shape her worth, but hearing it out loud, spoken so boldly, made her stomach twist. For a long moment, Julia said nothing. She could feel their eyes stabbing into her, waiting, savoring the moment. Then Clara leaned forward, her voice dripping with challenge. "So, Julia, are you going to show us, or are you just going to sit there proving us right?" Julia finally lifted her eyes. There was pain there, yes, but also something steadier, something none of them recognized yet. She didn't answer. Not yet. But inside, a decision was forming. What those girls didn't realize was that this wasn't the first time Julia had been cornered, mocked, or pushed aside. They thought today would be the day she broke, but they had no idea that it would be the day everything began to change. Rosa's knees ached as she pressed the wet rag against the marble floor, but the real pain came from the voices echoing behind her. Each word, maid's daughter, wannabe, pretend, stabbed at her chest like old wounds reopening. She had promised herself she wouldn't interfere. Julia had to learn to stand strong in a world that never expected anything from her. But it was torture. Every laugh, every sneer sounded like the voices Rosa had grown up with in her own childhood. Back in her small town, Rosa had dreamed of being a dancer too. Her grandmother had taught her folk rhythms from Venezuela, their feet moving with the earth, their bodies alive with music. But life had been unkind. Poverty, migration, and survival stole her chance long before she could ever step into a professional studio. Now, scrubbing these same floors where privileged children twirled in silk and satin, she saw her daughter facing the same cruelty she once endured. Only this time, Rosa couldn't shield her. She squeezed the rag tighter, the soapy water dripping onto the floor. Her heart screamed to run to Julia, to pull her out of the circle and tell those girls they would never understand the strength it took just to be there. But Rosa stayed quiet, shoulders hunched, her back turned to the storm. Julia looked across the room for a brief moment, their eyes meeting. In that single glance, Rosa tried to say everything words couldn't. Don't let them see you break. Don't give them what they want. You are more than they'll ever know. The circle of girls tightened again, Clara raising her chin like a queen addressing a servant. "So, what's it going to be, Julia?" she demanded. Julia didn't answer. Not yet. She turned her gaze away from them, back to her mother. Rosa's lips didn't move, but Julia could almost hear her voice in her mind, the same words she had whispered so many times during their secret evenings together in the empty studio. When they laugh, stand taller. When they mock, breathe deeper. And when they doubt you, show them who you really are. A hush fell for just a second, as if even the walls of the academy were waiting. Rosa straightened her back, still pretending to scrub the floor, but her eyes shone with unshed tears. Julia inhaled slowly, her chest rising. It was a small movement, but Rosa recognized it. That breath, that focus. It was the same ritual Julia always took before she practiced, before she allowed music and movement to carry her. The girls didn't see it. They still thought this was just a game, just another chance to humiliate. But Rosa knew. Something was about to shift. Clara clapped her hands together, the sound sharp and theatrical, commanding everyone's attention. "All right, Julia," she said, her tone dripping with mockery. "If you really think you deserve to be here, let's see what you can do." The girls laughed, circling tighter around Julia, their expensive ballet shoes squeaking against the polished floor.
Sophia raised her phone higher, adjusting the camera angle to capture the humiliation in full view. "What should we make her try?" Madison asked, her eyes gleaming. She was the best technical dancer of the group and loved any chance to remind everyone of it. "How about the sequence from Swan Lake? You know, the one with the fouettes." Gasps and giggles spread through the group. Even the younger students widened their eyes. That sequence wasn't just difficult, it was considered one of the hardest tests of balance and endurance in classical ballet. Clara's smile turned sly. "Yes, perfect. Let's see her try the fouette. And not just one or two. If she can manage, let's say 10 without falling, maybe we'll take her seriously." Sophia laughed out loud. "10? Are you kidding? Even I can barely make it to 12 without stumbling, and I've been training for 5 years." "That's the point," Clara replied, her eyes never leaving Julia. "We want her to fail." The circle of girls erupted in giggles. Phones were pointed, ready to record the disaster. This wasn't just a dare, it was a public sentence. If Julia failed, she wouldn't just be laughed at, she would be erased. She would never again sit quietly in the corner,
sketching her dreams while they rehearsed. Julia's stomach twisted. 10 fouettes. Her mind replayed the hours spent secretly practicing in the early mornings, barefoot on the cold studio floor when no one else was there. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "Don't dance for them. Dance for yourself, for something bigger than all of us." Across the hall, Rosa froze. Her rag slipped from her hand, forgotten. Her heart pounded as she realized what they were demanding. She knew exactly how cruel this was meant to be. Even experienced ballerinas trained for years to master such a sequence. But she also knew something the girls didn't. Julia had been preparing for this moment without even knowing it. "Come on," Madison pressed, crossing her arms like a judge. "Do it, unless you're scared." The word scared cut through the air like a blade. All eyes locked on Julia, waiting. Some smirked, others rolled their eyes, already convinced of the outcome. Julia looked at her mother once more. Rosa's lips pressed tightly together, but her eyes burned with a quiet fire. Julia took a breath. Then, to everyone's shock, she stood. Her notebook slipped from her lap and landed on the floor with a soft thud. Clara blinked, caught off guard. "Wait, are you actually?" "Yes," Julia interrupted, her voice steady though her hands trembled. "I'll do it." The room went silent. Even the giggles faded. Because none of them, not even Rosa, knew just how far Julia was about to go. As Julia stood in the center of the studio, her heart pounded like a drum echoing in her chest. The girls whispered among themselves, their smirks barely hiding the anticipation of her failure. Phones hovered in the air, lenses ready to capture the moment she fell. But Julia didn't rush. She closed her eyes and took a slow breath, the way her mother had taught her. In that instant, memories flooded back. Memories of nights when the academy was empty, the lights dimmed, and only the sound of Rosa's humming filled the hall. 3 years earlier, Rosa had noticed the way Julia's eyes sparkled every time she watched the students rehearse. She had seen her daughter sketching ballet positions in her notebook, imitating movements with her hands when she thought no one was watching. Rosa recognized the hunger, the same hunger she herself once had, before life forced her dreams into silence. So, when the academy emptied out late at night, Rosa turned her work into a gift. She would finish cleaning one room early and let Julia step onto the polished floor. No leotards, no point shoes, just bare feet and pure determination. "Listen to the silence," Rosa whispered on those secret nights. "Feel it. When you dance, you don't copy steps. You tell a story only you can tell." Julia practiced tirelessly. At first, her movements were clumsy, her balance wobbly.
But Rosa never criticized. She corrected gently, reminding her that true art wasn't about perfection. It was truth. And then came the fouettes. Rosa remembered seeing the older students trained for them, struggling despite their expensive lessons. Julia was fascinated. She begged her mother to teach her. Rosa hesitated. This was no small task, but she agreed. Not because she thought Julia needed to prove herself to anyone, but because she believed her daughter's spirit was strong enough to endure the challenge. Every morning, before dawn, Julia practiced in secret. Sometimes she spun until she fell, laughing through the bruises. Other times, frustration made her cry. But she never gave up. Slowly, the turns became smoother. Her body learned the rhythm, her arms found their strength, and her soul poured itself into each movement. "Remember," Rosa always said, her hands resting on Julia's shoulders, "when you spin, you are not turning for them. You are turning for you, for the little girl who dreamed, for the woman you will become, and for the voice inside you that refuses to be silenced." Now, standing in the circle of mockery, Julia carried all those mornings, all those secret lessons, in her heart. The girls thought this was just a dare. They thought she would stumble and cry. But Julia wasn't just standing there as the maid's daughter. She was standing as a dancer forged in silence, in sacrifice, and in love. And what she was about to unleash would change everything. The studio fell into an uneasy hush as Julia walked slowly to the very center of the polished floor. Every step she took seemed louder than it should have been, echoing against the mirrored walls. The girls who moments ago had been laughing and recording now stared at her with a mix of disbelief and anticipation. Clara crossed her arms, tilting her head like a judge about to deliver a sentence. "All right then," she said with a smirk, "let's see this little performance." Sophia held her phone tighter, whispering to the girl next to her, "This is going to be priceless." She angled the camera, already imagining the views the video would get once they posted
That online. Julia didn't respond. She closed her eyes. For a moment, it felt as if time itself had slowed down. Her heartbeat steadied, her breathing fell into rhythm, and the noise of whispers faded into the background. She remembered what her mother had always told her. Don't hear their voices, hear your own. Across the room, Rosa stopped moving. The rag slipped from her hand, forgotten on the floor. She straightened her back, staring at her daughter with wide eyes. She recognized the way Julia was holding herself, chin lifted, shoulders aligned, arms poised. It was the same posture she had seen countless times during their secret morning practices, the sign that Julia was no longer a shy girl, but a dancer ready to speak without words. The girls shifted uncomfortably. They had expected trembling, hesitation, maybe even tears. But there was none of that. Julia's face was calm, her eyes sharp when she finally opened them again. There was something in her gaze, a quiet intensity that made even the most confident girl swallow nervously. Clara rolled her eyes, trying to break the tension. "Don't waste our time," she snapped. "Hurry up before my tennis lesson." But the mocking tone didn't land the same way it usually did. The silence in the room was different now, heavy, charged. Julia lifted her arms slowly into fifth position, her bare feet gliding across the cold floor. The movement was simple, but something about it commanded attention. Even the youngest girl in the circle lowered her phone slightly, frowning as if trying to understand what she was seeing. Rosa's eyes filled with tears. She knew this moment. The breath before the first step, the stillness before the storm. It was the same pause she had once taken, long ago, before dancing in her grandmother's courtyard under the Venezuelan sun. But now it was her daughter, standing tall where no one expected her to belong. For a heartbeat, the studio held its breath. And then Julia whispered to herself, so softly only Rosa could catch it, "Let's begin." Julia's foot slid into position. Her arms rose with a precision that none of the girls had expected from someone in worn sneakers and simple clothes. For a second, even Clara's smirk faltered. Then, without hesitation, Julia began. The first flatte came, strong, controlled, not perfect by textbook standards, but alive, pulsing with something the others had never seen in their sterile routines. Her body didn't move with the polished stiffness of their expensive training. Instead, it carried weight, emotion, fire. Each turn wasn't just a movement, it was a declaration. 1, 2, 3. By the fourth spin, the laughter had stopped. The girls' mocking smiles melted into wide-eyed stares. The only sound left was the rhythm of Julia's breath and the faint squeak of her feet against the floor. "Wait," Sophia muttered under her breath, lowering her phone slightly. She's actually doing it?" Rosa pressed a hand to her mouth, tears threatening to spill. She recognized every detail. The way Julia's shoulders stayed steady, the strength in her core, the determination etched into her expression. These were the very things they had worked on together, night after night, in the empty studio when the world was asleep. 5, 6, 7. Clara tried to laugh, but the sound came out nervous, forced. "Don't get excited yet. She won't make it to 10. But Julia wasn't listening. Her eyes were focused, her body aligned. Each turn was smoother than the last, her movements gaining strength instead of losing it. 8, 9, 10. A murmur rippled through the circle. 10 fouettes. The number Clara had chosen as the impossible goal. Julia had already achieved it, and yet she didn't stop. 11, 12, 13. The air grew heavier with every spin. The girls who had prepared to film her humiliation now found themselves recording history. Their cameras shook in their hands, not because Julia was failing, but because they couldn't believe what they were seeing. 14, 15, 16. Madison, the most technically trained, felt her chest tighten. It had taken her years to reach 16 without falling, and even then she rarely managed it in front of an audience. But Julia, this girl they all mocked, was gliding past that number as if she had been born for it. The silence in the room was deafening now. By the 20th spin, one of the younger girls lowered her phone completely, whispering, This isn't normal." And she was right. This wasn't just technique. It wasn't something money could buy. It was raw, unfiltered passion, an art born from struggle, from sacrifice, from a soul that refused to stay silent. Rosa's tears finally spilled over. She knew exactly what was happening. Julia wasn't just dancing, she was reclaiming every insult, every sneer, every dismissal, and transforming it into something no one in that room could ignore. Julia's storm had begun. By the 25th spin, the air inside the studio
Electric. The mirrors reflected Julia's determined figure over and over again, as if the room itself wanted to multiply her strength. The girls who once laughed now stood frozen, their phones trembling in their hands. The spectacle they had planned to humiliate her was turning into something they couldn't comprehend. Madison's jaw tightened. Her arms, once crossed in smug superiority, now hung limp at her sides. She had spent years training under the most expensive instructors in the state. And yet this girl, the maid's daughter, was surpassing limits Madison herself still struggled to reach. Clara shifted uncomfortably. For the first time, her confident smirk was gone. The icy certainty in her eyes had melted into doubt. This isn't possible," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. Rosa stood still, no longer pretending to clean. Her rag lay forgotten on the floor, her chest rising and falling as she fought back sobs. But these tears weren't from pain this time. They were from pride, from vindication. Every sacrifice, every early morning when she taught Julia in secret, every bruise, every whispered encouragement, it was all here, alive in her daughter's movements.
The silence in the studio deepened with each turn. Even the giggles of the younger girls had stopped, their mocking smiles replaced by awe. One of them, barely 11 years old, lowered her phone completely, whispering to the girl next to her, It's like she's not just dancing, she's telling a story." And she was right. Julia's performance wasn't just about technique. Each fouetté carried weight. It carried Rosa's struggles, Julia's silent mornings of practice, the sting of every cruel word they had endured. This wasn't about ballet anymore. It was about proving that talent, dignity, and strength could bloom in the very places the world least expected. 30, 31, 32. The circle of girls swayed slightly, as if the ground beneath them had shifted. Their arrogance cracked, giving way to something far more unfamiliar: respect. Sophia, who had started the recording with a smirk, now held her phone with trembling hands. Her lips quivered as she muttered, "Oh my God, this video, this isn't going to humiliate her. This is something else entirely." Rosa pressed her hand to her heart. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of her family's past lifting. Julia was not just defending herself. She was defending Rosa, her grandmother, and every generation of women told they weren't enough. When Julia finally landed gracefully on her bare feet, stopping at the 45th fouetté, the silence that followed was deafening. It was no longer the silence of mockery. It was the silence of revelation. For a long moment after Julia's final spin, the studio was swallowed by silence. The air was thick, charged with the weight of something unexplainable. Even the faint hum of the air conditioner seemed to vanish. Julia stood in the center of the room, chest rising and falling, her arms lowered gracefully by her sides. Her eyes, steady and calm, swept across the stunned faces of the girls who had once circled her like predators. Madison was the first to break. Her lips parted, but no words came out at first. Finally, with a trembling voice, she whispered, 45 fouettes. She repeated it again, almost as if saying it aloud might help her believe it. "I've never seen anyone do that, not even in competitions." Clara's face was pale. The mocking queen of the academy now looked small, fragile even, as if the crown she had worn so arrogantly had crumbled. "That's impossible," she muttered, but her voice lacked conviction. The certainty she once carried had vanished, replaced by fear and awe. Sophia lowered her phone, staring at the blurry recording on her screen. Her hands shook so badly the image trembled. What she had intended to use as proof of Julia's humiliation had become undeniable evidence of her greatness. Her throat tightened as tears formed at the corners of her eyes, tears not of pity but of shame. From the back of the room, Rosa finally moved. She crossed the floor slowly, her steps echoing in the stunned silence. Her hands shook as she reached her daughter, pulling her into a tight embrace. "Estoy orgullosa de ti, mi hija," she whispered, her Spanish accent thick with emotion. "I am so proud of you." Julia closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of her mother's arms shield her. But when she looked up again, her gaze went straight to Clara. "You wanted me to prove myself," she said softly, her voice calm but firm. "Now tell me, was that enough?" Clara's lips trembled. She looked down at her shoes, unable to meet Julia's gaze. For the first time, she didn't have an insult, a command, or a laugh. All she could muster was a faint, broken, I'm sorry." One by one, the other girls echoed the sentiment. Madison, her pride shattered, nodded slowly. "Julia, you're incredible. Better
than any of us. I shouldn't have treated you that way." The sound of applause began softly. Madison's palms, red from the force of her clapping, were wet with tears. Then Sophia joined, followed by the younger girls, until the studio was filled with the sound of genuine recognition. No mockery, no condescension, only respect. Julia stood taller. She hadn't just proven herself, she had shifted the balance of the entire room. The same girls who had tried to erase her presence were now admitting, through their own applause, that she had earned her place, not as a maid's daughter, but as a dancer whose soul had broken every boundary they thought mattered. For Julia, it wasn't just victory, it was justice. The sound of applause filled the studio, echoing against the mirrored walls like thunder. But this wasn't the hollow, mocking kind Julia had grown used to. It was real, raw admiration that even the girls themselves didn't fully understand. They had come expecting a show of humiliation. Instead, they had witnessed a miracle. Julia stood in the center, her chest steady, her face calm. For the first time in her life inside this academy, she wasn't invisible. She wasn't the maid's daughter. She was a dancer. Miss Williams, the head instructor, had returned early from her meeting and stood at the doorway, her briefcase slipping from her grasp as she stared in shock. Her trained eyes had caught Julia's final spins. What she saw wasn't simply technique, it was authenticity, something no amount of money could buy. "Julia," she said softly, her voice carrying a reverence usually reserved for professionals, "we need to talk." Every head turned toward her. The girls gasped. To hear their teacher speak to Julia in that tone, it was unthinkable. Julia blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. "Talk?" Miss Williams stepped into the room, her expression still one of disbelief. "What you just did? It's extraordinary. Not even my top students could achieve that at your age, and yet you did, without formal training." Her eyes moved to Rosa, who was wiping tears from her cheeks. "This is no accident. This is talent, pure talent." Rosa's lips quivered as she whispered, "She has been learning. From me. From my grandmother before me." Her voice cracked with both pride and humility. The revelation spread like fire. The same girls who had mocked Julia for years now realized that greatness didn't come from privilege or polished shoes or expensive lessons. It came from resilience, from roots, from spirit. In the weeks that followed, everything changed. Clara and Madison, once untouchable, began to share the stage with Julia, not out of pity, but because they finally understood that dance was bigger than them. Sophia's recording went online, but instead of shame, it sparked awe. Millions watched, calling Julia a prodigy. The academy itself transformed. Miss Williams created a scholarship program in Julia's honor, giving opportunities to other children from overlooked backgrounds. For the first time, the polished halls opened to those who had been told they didn't belong. As for Julia, she didn't dance for recognition or revenge. She danced because it was who she was, because every spin carried her mother's sacrifices, her grandmother's heritage, and her own unbreakable voice. Months later, Julia stood on an international stage in Paris, representing not just herself, but every child who had ever been underestimated. As the spotlight bathed her in gold, she remembered Rosa's words, "When the soul speaks, everyone listens." And that night, the whole world listened.